Unit 3 Review Honors Biology. You can access this video and this review at srhsbio.wikispaces.com or YouTube channel LEFFELlabs. The first question asks us to complete a table about photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So the reactants for photosynthesis are going to be carbon dioxide, water, and energy in the form of sunlight. For cellular respiration, the reactants are sugars, specifically glucose, and oxygen. For photosynthesis, the products that we make are sugars, specifically glucose, and oxygen. And for cellular respiration, what we make is carbon dioxide, water, and energy, this time in the form of ATP. So photosynthesis and cellular respiration are opposite processes. The reactants of one are the products of the other. And we can see this whenever we look at the equation. So for photosynthesis, we have 6 carbon dioxides coming together with 6 waters to make sugar and oxygen. And if we look at the equation for cellular respiration, we see it's the complete opposite. We start with sugar and oxygen, and we make carbon dioxide and water. For photosynthesis, the key organelle is going to be chloroplasts. Chloroplasts capture energy from sunlight. So inside of the chloroplasts, we see those green stacks on the screen. Those are thalkaloids, and inside of them are pigments. These pigments absorb energy from the sunlight. Plant cells undergo photosynthesis. For cellular respiration, the key organelle is the mitochondria. So here is a mitochondria. The mitochondria takes the energy stored in the chemical bonds of glucose and breaks that glucose down to produce ATP, which is usable cellular energy. This happens in both plant and animal cells. The next question asks you to sort the following into prokaryote, eukaryote, or both. So, one thing to remember. Prokaryote. If you're a pro at something, it means that you've been doing it for a long time. So these are going to be the older cells that have been around for longer. Eukaryote, the U sounds like new. So these are newer, more modern cells. So the type of cells that are generally considered to be more advanced, those are going to be eukaryotic cells. Mitochondria produce energy from sugars. They are found in both prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. All cells need some method to harvest and generate energy for cellular processes. So for many types of cells, this is going to be through mitochondria. Nuclear membrane is found only in eukaryotic cells. Membrane-bound organelles, those are eukaryotic cells. And the nucleus is an example of an organelle, and it is bound by a nuclear membrane. A single circular ring of DNA is going to be a prokaryotic cell. Again, these are older, simpler cells, so their DNA isn't quite as extensive or complicated as it is for a eukaryotic cell. But prokaryotic cells were the only form of life on Earth for billions of years. So all eukaryotic cells came from a prokaryotic cell. They evolved from them. Bacteria, which is the largest and most diverse group of organisms, those are considered prokaryotic cells. The cell membrane, ribosomes, and cell wall are found in both prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. The cell membrane is responsible for regulating what enters and exits the cell, so all cells need that in order to maintain homeostasis. Ribosomes are involved with protein synthesis. All cells need some way to read the DNA and read that code so they can make proteins. And cell wall is found in both eukaryotic plant cells as well as prokaryotic bacterial cells. The next table asks us to indicate if the organelle is found in plant cells, animal cells, or both. So, here is a plant cell. We can tell that it is a plant cell. Number one, it's green. Number two, it has this square kind of regular shape, and that's due to the cell wall. So, plant cells have cell walls. They do not have centrioles, but plant and animal cells are going to both have cytoplasm. Ribosomes are present in plant cells. Plant cells have DNA, and that DNA needs to be read into proteins. Mitochondria are responsible for taking the sugars that are produced during photosynthesis and breaking them down to release ATP. Sugars are much more stable than ATP. So if a cell is trying to store energy that it can then access later, it's going to store it in the form of sugar, which mitochondria will break down to re-release that energy. Chloroplasts are, of course, in plant cells. This is what gives them their green color. So inside of that chloroplast, there are those stacks of alkaloids which contain the green pigments. And plant cells have a cell membrane. Again, cell membrane is responsible for what enters and exits the cell. So all cells need that in order to maintain homeostasis. Now let's look at an animal cell. So if you look at the animal cell, it's a little bit different. For one, it's not square. That's because there is no cell wall in animal cells. We can see the centrioles here. Those are going to help the cell whenever it gets ready to divide. Cytoplasm, that's the goo inside of the cell. Ribosomes are also present. Again, these are involved with protein synthesis. There are mitochondria to break down sugars, except in animal cells, sugars have to come from diet. So whatever organism this animal cell belongs to, they have to eat sugars from plants or from other organisms, and the mitochondria then break down those sugars to release ATP. Chloroplasts are not present in animal cells, but there is a cell membrane. That is the gatekeeper of the cell, which controls what enters and exits the cell. The next question asks us to complete a flow map about photosynthesis. The next question asks us to complete a flow map about photosynthesis by describing what happens during each phase. So photosynthesis is broken down into two phases. There are the light-dependent reactions, also called the light reactions, and the light-independent reactions, also called the dark reactions. Light-dependent reactions only happen when sunlight is present. The light-independent reactions can happen day or night. So for the light-dependent reactions, first, light has to hit the thalkaloid where pigments absorb that energy from the sun, and that is used to generate ATP from ADP. Next, water is split, and the hydrogen ions produced from splitting that water is used to regenerate NADPH from NADP. During this process, oxygen is also given off. So that's it for the light-dependent reactions. Light energy and water are used to generate ATP and NADPH. Those are going to be fed into the light-independent reactions. So the next phase, light-independent reactions. First, we're going to have ATP, NADPH, and 6 carbon dioxide molecules enter into what's called the Calvin cycle. And again, all of this is happening inside of a chloroplast of a plant cell. So there are many, many chloroplasts inside a single plant cell that are all doing this at the same time. Next, the unstable energy of ATP and NADPH is used to link together carbons to make sugars. So the carbon comes from the carbon dioxide. We link 6 of those together to make glucose. ATP and NADPH are used up during this process. They're like rechargeable batteries. So now the NADP and the ADP are going to go back into the light-dependent reactions where they can be recharged. And of course, the product of this is going to be sugars. So we see we have water and carbon dioxide going into photosynthesis, and oxygen and sugars coming out of photosynthesis. If there was more carbon dioxide means more photosynthesis. This is called carbon seeding. The energy of photosynthesis to synthesize those sugars comes from ATP. ATP is unstable, so the plant cell uses it to store it in a more stable form of energy, glucose. One way that we can measure how quickly photosynthesis is occurring is by measuring the amount of oxygen given off. So we did this in class. We tried to do it in class, where we were trying to measure the volume of oxygen produced by some pond plants. You could also count the number of bubbles. Any of those things are acceptable to determine the rate of photosynthesis. The next question asks us to complete a flow map about cellular respiration by describing what happens during each phase. So cellular respiration is split into 3 distinct parts. First, glycolysis occurs. So glyco means sugar, lysis means breaking. So glycolysis is just breaking down sugar. To break down the glucose, we're going to use 2 ATP, which is going to break the glucose, a 6-carbon compound, into pyruvate, a 3-carbon compound. Next, we're going to make NADH. This is going to be regenerated. This is going to go to step 7, which is the electron transport chain. In step 3, we make a total of 4 ATP, but we used up 2 in order to break glucose. So we make a net of 2 ATP. The whole purpose of cellular respiration is to take the chemical energy stored in sugar and convert it into a usable form by the cell. So this is going to be ATP. ATP, anything that is required to use energy, the cell is going to use ATP. So removal of waste, muscular movement, cell division, these all require ATP. Next, we are going to move from glycolysis, which takes place in the cytoplasm, to the Krebs cycle, which takes place inside of a mitochondria. So, pyruvate enters the Krebs cycle in the mitochondria. As pyruvate is broken down further, we're going to make 2 ATP as well as 2 carbon dioxide. We are also going to make a compound called FADH2 and more NADH. So these are rechargeable batteries. We're using this energy to regenerate the FADH2 and the NADH. This is all going to go to the electron transport chain in step 7. So the next step is still going on inside of the mitochondria. This is the electron transport chain. So all of the NADH and the FADH2 and oxygen is going to go into the electron transport chain. So in order for cellular respiration to occur, we need glucose and we need oxygen. Water, H2O, is given off as part of this process. This is where the cell really cashes in with the ATP. So during the electron transport chain, we're going to make 32 ATP. This means that through cellular respiration, the cell makes a total of 36 ATP. Keep in mind, this is just looking at one mitochondria. Inside of a cell, there's usually hundreds of mitochondria, and they're all doing this reaction at the same time. So lots and lots of ATP are being made. Next question asks about what would happen for cellular respiration if there was no oxygen present. So without oxygen, aerobic respiration cannot take place. Anaerobic respiration occurs without oxygen in the cytoplasm of the cell. So glycolysis happens first. This is the same for aerobic and anaerobic. But if there is no oxygen present, then we're either going to go through alcoholic fermentation or we're going to go through lactic acid fermentation. So first glycolysis followed by fermentation. This is all happening in the cytoplasm of the cell. The next question asks us to summarize the two types of anaerobic respiration. So first we have alcoholic fermentation. This is where NADH, which is produced during glycolysis, is used to break pyruvate down into ethyl alcohol and carbon dioxide. We saw in class that the rate of this reaction is dependent on the temperature. The yeasts which undergo this process, they cannot survive above certain temperatures. This is because the enzymes necessary for this process start to break down after the temperatures get too high. This means that they can't break down sugar, they can't generate that energy for cellular processes. In lactic acid fermentation, the NADH produced during glycolysis is used to break pyruvate down into lactic acid. So alcoholic fermentation, this was what happens with yeast. This is used to make bread rise, to make beer, and to make wine. Whenever you make bread, the carbon dioxide is what gives the bread the bubbles and helps the bread to rise, and all of the ethyl alcohol gets burned off in the oven. And this is also how we make beer and wine. Lactic acid fermentation, you would experience this in your muscle cells after a hard workout. A hard workout can deplete the cell's oxygen, and lactic acid can build up on those muscle cells, eventually leading to muscle cramps. Next question is about plants and the two ways that they produce ATP. So the first way, during the light-dependent reaction of photosynthesis, energy from the sun is absorbed by pigments in the thalkaloids. This is used to make ATP. The ATP that has been generated then goes into the Calvin cycle along with carbon dioxide to make sugars. ATP is unstable. If it's not used, it's lost. So the energy in ATP is stored for long-term use by assembling sugars. The other way that plants produce ATP is during cellular respiration. So once the plants have made those sugars and they've stored them away, if the plant needs the sugar, say during the winter where there's not lots of sunlight, or the plant needs to grow or repair a broken limb, the sugars could then be broken down to make ATP. In animal cells, this is the only way that they make ATP. They don't have any photosynthetic pigments to make ATP. So ATP for animals only comes from cellular respiration, but for plants, it comes from absorption of light energy by pigments and from cellular respiration and breaking down sugars. For number 9, a new species of bacteria has been discovered living in a cave in Cueva de los Cristales in Mexico, and evidence shows that this bacteria is the base of the food chain. Describe how this organism might make carbohydrates even though no sun is present. So, out in the open, where there is sunlight, plants are the base of the food chain because they take that energy from the sun and they convert it into chemical energy, which cells can then use to generate ATP, which is usable cellular energy. In chemosynthesis, we don't have any sun. So the things that are at the base of the food chain, they need to find some other way to get that energy so they can generate carbohydrates. So this process uses energy from chemical reactions instead of light to assemble sugars. So we are taking inorganic substances from the environment. You can see up here that we're taking hydrogen sulfide, oxygen, and forming sulfur compounds. We are then using those chemical reactions, the energy generated during those reactions, to make food, sugars, to form the base of the food chain. The sugars that are made can then be broken down to release ATP with cellular respiration. So this happens in caves, it happens deep sea. These chemosynthetic bacteria can form the base of the food chain where there is no sun. The next question asks us to consider the flow of matter and energy through the ecosystem. So first we have to create a representation, so that's just a fancy way of saying a picture, showing the flow of energy through an ecosystem using sunlight, photosynthesis, and cellular respiration. So this question is specifically asking about energy. So the ultimate source of all energy on Earth is the sun. Light energy is absorbed by pigments inside of photosynthetic organisms, which is used to make ATP, a chemical form of energy. ATP is then used to create sugars, storing this energy in the chemical bonds of glucose. So there's some glucose. And this energy can then be used by other organisms, like humans who eat the plants, to generate ATP. So sugars are broken down during cellular respirations to generate ATP, usable cellular energy. The next question asks us to explain why energy must be constantly added to the ecosystem in the form of sunlight. So if we look at this process, we see that it's linear. It's not a closed cycle. Every time energy changes forms, so whenever the light energy is changed into ATP, and when the ATP is changed into sugars, and when the sugars are changed back into ATP, every time energy changes forms, some of it is lost. So we have to continuously add energy in order to support all of the different organisms in the ecosystem. Next question asks us what would happen to the overall biomass of an ecosystem if sunlight was not available. So light is needed to produce sugars through photosynthesis. If we don't have any light, we don't have any sugars. So with no light, no sugars can be made. Without sugar, organisms cannot get the energy they need to grow, leading to an eventual decrease in biomass. The next question says create a representation, again that's just a picture, showing the movement of matter through an ecosystem using photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So this time we're actually asking about the matter, the atoms, where do they go and how are they being used. So first, light energy is used to create chemical energy in the form of ATP. This is used to make sugars. So photosynthesis produces oxygen and sugars. Humans and other organisms can breathe in the oxygen and eat the sugars in order to undergo cellular respiration. During that process, carbon dioxide and water are generated as well. These are the starting reactants for photosynthesis, so this cycle can continue. So this system is closed. It is a closed loop, which means that the matter is staying constant. We also make lots of ATP during cellular respiration. And that doesn't just happen in animals, it also happens in plants as well. This is what keeps the percent of oxygen in our atmosphere fairly constant. Because this process is constantly occurring, oxygen is being recycled, matter is moving from one organism to another, and that keeps the percent of oxygen in the air pretty much constant. The next question asks us to label photosynthesis and cellular respiration in this sample carbon cycle. So, photosynthesis is what's occurring whenever plants are taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and using it to generate sugars. In blue, we have cellular respiration. So plants do this, animals do this, the bacteria in the soil do this. This all breaks down sugars to produce carbon dioxide, which goes into the atmosphere. These other arrows, so when an animal dies and it gets decomposed by soil bacteria, that is what links animals to soil bacteria. Same thing with plants. When a plant dies, it is decomposed by soil bacteria. The arrow going from the plants to the animals is because the animals are eating the plants. And over here we have another source of carbon dioxide. This is anthropogenic, which means human-based. This is whenever we take coal and oil, dig it up out of the ground, and burn it as fuel. This chemical reaction is very similar to cellular respiration, and we produce carbon dioxide.